share the screen. Some power, is that great?
Great, thank you.
And there's the laser. Just that little one on the top.
That's great, thank you.
So Paul is from Newcastle University and is going to discuss the validity of Soundproof approximation. Paul?
Thank you. Yep, so I'd like to start by thanking the organisers of this programme. It's been a very, very nice programme to be here. I thank the Newton Institute as well for its hospitality. Particularly like to thank the organisers of what's been a very nice workshop and for giving me the opportunity to present during this final session today. So when preparing this talk, I was very aware I was the last speaker on Friday afternoon. So that certainly influenced my thinking in terms of how much content to try and cram into here. So hopefully I've kept it within time. I guess that's the golden rule for such speakers, but I guess we'll find out in half an hour or so whether I've been successful or not. So I should say that this is work that's been done primarily by John Moss, who's a PhD student working with myself and Toby Wood at Newcastle. John unfortunately isn't here, so I'm afraid you're stuck with me. I thought it was a good opportunity to present this work to this particular audience. Okay. I should also say very briefly that this was published a couple of months ago in Phys-Rev Fluids, so I'm going to go quite lightly on the details here. If you want to delve into the details a little bit further, you've got an opportunity to do so there. All right. So, magnetic buoyancy. So this is the first part of my title. So we've heard a little bit about this already this week. And again, the nice thing about speaking at the end of a meeting is you don't have to give too much by way of introduction, but I think there's a few things I just want to pick out. So the basic idea of magnetic buoyancy goes back to the mid-50s, Parker and Jensen, I guess. So if you take Parker's model, for example, he envisaged some kind of thin magnetic flux tube in thermal equilibrium in its non-magnetic surroundings within the solar interior. And the idea is that if, because of the contribution of the magnetic pressure, so I'll try and balance this again, to the total pressure balance, actually the gas pressure and then the density itself within the tube must be less than its surroundings, so tubes will tend to rise. That's the idea. And we believe, I'll maybe kind of qualify this a little bit, but we certainly believe that there is some large-scale toroidal field somewhere within the solar interior. I'm going to argue in a few slides' time, I think this is most likely the tachocline. So somewhere within the solar interior, we believe there is going to be some magnetic field that's going to be susceptible to magnetic buoyancy. That's the idea. And as I think a few people have noted actually during this week, magnetic buoyancy might be more than just a byproduct of the solar dynamo. It could itself be playing an active role in the regeneration of the poloidal field. It does so in the Babcock-Layton framework, for example. It also could do it as an instability around the base of the convection zone as well. We're looking at this a little bit as well at Newcastle. I'm not going to talk about that today, though. That's a sort of a talk for another day, let's say. So this is a workshop which is about connecting theory to observations. So I've kind of illustrated two extremes of the process here in terms of magnetic buoyancy. So, of course, the paradigm is that somewhere within the solar interior, we believe there is some instability, which is producing this rising loop of magnetic flux, which then breaks through the surface of the sun, forming these bipolar active regions. But I would argue there's quite a gap in between these two images. And I think whilst we've got bits of the piece, sort of bits of the jigsaw that we do understand, I think there's still quite a bit of this process that still requires a little bit more by way of modelling efforts to actually gain insight into what's actually going on. So this is where this sort of study comes in. So soundproof, the other sort of phrase in my title. So again, a lot of these ideas will be familiar to a lot of you. Magnetic buoyancy is inherently compressible, right? You can't get away from the fact you need to include some effects of compressibility if you're modelling magnetic buoyancy. So you need stratification, these sorts of things. But certainly if you run these sorts of things and have a look at the kind of instabilities that you see, dynamics tend to be pretty slow compared to the local sound speed. So if you're running a computational model, you don't really want to be spending a lot of time and effort chasing sound waves around your domain. Right, that's a sort of fundamental idea. So, it makes sense then to try and filter out these sound waves. There are various things you could do. Of course, you could use something like the reduced speed of sound technique, and we've heard a little bit about that this week. You could try to construct an implicit solver of some sort, which would also relax the kind of constraints that sound waves place upon these sorts of numerical schemes. But I think it's kind of mathematically nice to try and filter these sorts of things out at source, get rid of the sound waves from your governing equations and try and solve these instead. So a few of these soundproof models will be familiar to a lot of you. We've heard a lot about some of these already this week, so I can skip through this quite quickly. The Boussinesq approximation in its standard formulation doesn't actually describe magnetic buoyancy, so it needs to be tweaked a little bit. Spiegel and Weiss worked out how to do that in the early 80s, subsequently put on a sort of asymptotic footing by Caulfield in 1984. Anelastic, I'm actually going to distinguish between two different formulations for reasons that become clear later on in this talk. So there's a formulation, the original formulation due to Goff, Gilman and Glatzmeyer, which I've labelled here GGG, so I'll use that terminology quite a lot through this talk. And then there's perhaps the more familiar Lance Baginski-Roberts formulation, which I think it probably covers the majority of the talks that we've actually seen this week, I think, in terms of modelling. Okay? So I'll say much more about these different formulations as this talk progresses, so don't worry about the details at this stage. The final approximation is the so-called pseudo-incompressible approximation, which was introduced in the hydrodynamic context by Duran in the late 80s. He kind of envisaged this as a sort of improvement, if you like, upon the anelastic approximation. And by placing a constraint on the pressure rather than the density, the pseudo-incompressible approximation allows essentially fluid elements to expand or contract in response to local heating. That's the idea. This has a nasty consequence for your velocity constraint, as we shall see again in a few slides' time. So this was generalized to include magnetic fields by Vasil and collaborators about a decade ago in 2013. So there's lots and lots of these models. So the kind of natural question you can ask yourself is, which of these models should we be using if we wish to describe magnetic buoyancy in the solar interior? There's been quite a few people who've looked at this, focusing on kind of particular examples of these soundproof approximations, typically that anelastic approximation. The approach we've taken is a more general one. What we try to do is we try to derive a kind of generalized framework which contains various coefficients that we're then going to try to constrain based on comparing the dynamics of this system with the fully compressible equations. That's the idea. So again, how I do this will become clear in a few slides' time. It's fair to say that when this paper was reviewed, this approach rather divided the crowd. One of the reviewers liked it. One of the reviewers described it as tautological artifice. So, you know, make of that what you will. I think maybe my own position is that's a little unfair. I think this is actually quite a useful framework to consider, but I'll let you be the judge of that towards the end of this talk. Okay, so the final piece of motivation I want to put in place is just to say a little bit about how we apply these sorts of models in the solar interior. And maybe I'm going to be a little bit provocative on this slide, but I think there's some important points that are worth making. So if you're going to try and use a soundproof model, you know, what you might like to do is come through some kind of asymptotic derivation, and typically it turns out that in order to derive these things, you tend to have to make some really rather restrictive approximations to your governing equations. In particular, quite a lot of these models need a near adiabatic stratification formally in order to be asymptotically derived, and that's pretty restrictive. Of course, it breaks down, as we all know, near the upper layers of the convection zone. You need a fully compressible model, really, to capture what's going on there. But as this cartoon from Mark Misch's Living Review article kind of illustrates, in the convection zone itself, the radial entropy gradient is pretty flat, nearly zero, so it's probably a pretty good approximation in this case for the bulk of the solar convection zone. So if you're running a kind of convection model, these sorts of things, you know, any soundproof model will probably give you a pretty good approximation to what's going on. Where things get a bit more sticky is actually where you try to apply these models to the stably stratified region below. And then I think you need to be a bit more careful about how you proceed in order to use these particular models. Particularly, we see quite a sort of rapid transition, if you like, from a near adiabatically stratified region to quite a strongly sub-adiabatically stratified layer just below. So that's certainly something we need to bear in mind when applying these sorts of models in this context. So as I've indicated, my own view, and again there'll be some of the audience that disagree, is probably the strongest toroidal field in the solar interior is likely to be sited around the tachocline. I think there are various good reasons for making this assertion, let's say. Firstly, it's the site of strong differential rotation, as we've seen, so that's certainly going to tend to amplify any flux that's there. And we also know, of course, that convective motions tend to sort of push magnetic flux downwards. So it'll also be a preferential site for flux accumulation as well. And so we'd expect this region to be a preferred location for the storage of magnetic flux. So probably we can't get away from the fact that if we're going to try to model magnetic buoyancy, we're going to need to use some equations which are capable of actually describing this process in this region. And that's a little bit of a headache in terms of soundproof approximation. So the model that we've considered is in some sense almost the simplest one you can write down that doesn't approximate much. Okay, so sort of relatively simple ideas. It's a fairly idealized model, fully compressible, in viscid fluid. We're going to assume it's a perfect electrical conductor as well, with just a constant gravitational acceleration that's in the z direction, so it's just heading downwards. And then we write down the standard compressible MHD equation. So the only sort of non-ideal effect we've got here is in the entropy equation. So that's the sum of all potential diabatic processes, which might be something like thermal diffusion, for example. And if you're running magnetic buoyancy, well, the kind of thing you'd want to do is you'd want to kind of take some sort of background state, so rho 0, T0, S0, whatever, as a function of Z only, because there's no X or Y dependency in this particular configuration. And you just have a magnetic layer then that's purely in the X direction, with an amplitude that's going to vary as a function of height. So it's a very, very simple geometry, very much like the kind of Parker setup, but extended to a layer rather than a thin magnetic flux tube. Just a little note, we're going to see later that we're going to need the magnetic field amplitude to decrease with height in order to get the instability to work. So once you've set up your background state, and I'll say a little bit more about how the background state is defined on the next slide, essentially we're going to do the 0th order thing. We're going to essentially sort of take our background state, perturb it, linearize the resulting equations, and then ask ourselves the question, do we have an instability or not? So a very simple idea. So there's a few kind of quantities that are going to crop up repeatedly over the course of the next few slides, so I thought I'd collect them all here. I've got total pressure, pi, which is the sum of the gas pressure and then the magnetic pressure that comes out of the Lorentz force. So that, again, we'll see quite a bit of. There are two characteristic velocities associated with the background state. There's the sound speed c squared, well, defined in terms of c squared and v squared. Sound speed is c, which, so c is the square root of gamma p naught over rho naught, and you've also got the alpha vane speed as well, which looks like b naught over root mu naught rho naught as well. Okay. Then the rest of the problem is then specified essentially by defining some scale heights. So that tells you essentially how your background state changes as a function of depth. So again, we've got a scale height here, again defined in its reciprocal form. So h rho, or h rho inverse in this case, defined to be minus 1 over rho naught, d rho naught dz. Similarly for hb, we've got an entropy scale height as well, which is defined slightly differently, but these are all defined in such a way that they are positive quantities in this particular case. Okay. So again, that's probably details more for the aficionados, but hopefully that at least gives you a sense of what these quantities actually are. Okay, so the one final point I'll make is that in the background state, we obviously need to have an equilibrium condition that's satisfied by whatever our initial profile actually looks like, and that's essentially defined in this sort of way. We've got a balance of the total pressure, the derivative thereof, against buoyancy. And you can reframe that if you like, and these are entirely equivalent statements in terms of g and these various scale heights and velocities. Okay, so we'll see this kind of cropping up quite a bit, again, over the course of the next few slides. And all that is, it's just a statement of magnetohydrostatic equilibrium. Okay, so we can make kind of rapid progress now, I think. So we're now going to linearize these equations. So that's literally all we've done. We've taken our sort of compressible equations. So the paper I noted on the first slide, we actually do this for a general equation of state. I thought I'd spare you that here. So we're assuming an ideal gas, just to keep things a little bit simpler. But that's the only thing that's been put in here, and that defines essentially P1 and T1. The rest of this is exactly as we've seen before. Just to make life a little bit simpler for ourselves, we picked a very simple prescription for the diabatic processes in the entropy equation, simply a nice Newtonian cooling term, which just makes things a little bit easier. That is an idealization, it has to be said, but actually it doesn't affect the results I'm actually going to be presenting by and large today. Okay. So here's the slide I want to spend a little bit of time explaining. So this is our generalized model that I trailed a few slides ago. So it looks very much like the compressible model that I've just written down. You can see it's got various coefficients, A, D, F, G, and J. We rapidly run out of letters, so there's lots and lots of coefficients going on here. So just to kind of sort of talk you through a lot of this looks the same. Induction equation is unaltered. Entropy equation is unaltered. This is largely unaltered. All this square bracket quantity is, that's just the pressure, that's just the density perturbation, should I say. So that's just the standard momentum equation. Of course, the big difference for any soundproof model is rather than having an equation which tells you how rho changes in time, you swap that out for a velocity constraint. That's the idea. Okay. So we've removed one-time derivative, hence we've removed sound waves from the problem. Okay. So I've kind of defined here in the paper, and again, we go through this in quite a lot of detail trying to justify all of this. I'll give you a little bit of a flavour as to why these particular choices of coefficients correspond to these various different approximations, just to kind of try and convince you that at least it's plausible. So if we look at this constraint first, if we set f to be 0 and pick a to be c squared over gh rho, you see there's a lot of cancellation going on in this term, and we can rewrite that as div of rho u is 0. So that's just the standard anelastic constraint. That's the idea. Okay, so that's hopefully familiar, albeit written in an unfamiliar form in this case. Pseudo-incompressible is a little bit different. I'll come back to my Boussinesq in a second. Pseudo-incompressible, as I indicated, gives you a constraint on the pressure rather than the density. So the coefficient there differs. A is 1 in this case. And we also have this horrible term that appears in our constraint, which is due to heating. So this allows fluid elements to expand or contract in response to whatever our local heating actually is. And anyone who runs numerics might like to think how you might go about imposing this particular constraint. And it's certainly challenging, it's fair to say, for numerical models. And I think that probably explains in parts its perhaps lack of popularity in the astrophysical literature. So that's a tricky one. Boussinesq is a slightly funny one. So the way Boussinesq equations are defined, they're defined in a rather anisotropic way. It's actually the components of the field and the flow perpendicular to the mean field that are solenoidal. So in order to kind of crowbar this into our framework, we've taken core fields analysis and retained not only the leading order terms, but also the next order terms as well. And so the constraint for Boussinesq looks rather similar to that of the others. So that's the constraints. We'll say a little bit about this term here. So this, remember, is just the pressure. This is, the density perturbation. Apologies. Okay, so most of these are pretty much consistent. The big difference is between GGG anelastic and LBR anelastic, because, of course, the Lance-Braginski-Roberts formulation makes an additional assumption in the momentum equation, assuming that your background state is close to adiabatic. And that's reflected in this change of coefficients that we see. D is 1 for the GGG version. D is c squared over gh rho for the LBR version. The other difference between these two formulations comes in the definition of the temperature. Okay, so in the LBR formulation, it's typically assumed that temperature perturbation is proportional to density, which means that you diffuse entropy rather than diffuse temperature. That's the idea. Okay, but again, that is an approximation, albeit probably a very good one for most circumstances. Final thing to say is just a note about this total pressure perturbation. Almost all of these models take J as 1, which exactly corresponds to the fully compressible case. Boussinesq is a bit different. That assumes the total pressure perturbation vanishes. So in that case, there's just then a balance between these two terms then on the right-hand side. Okay, so that's a 5-minute kind of introduction as to why this is sensible. As I say, many further details can be found in this paper. All right. Good. So having sort of spent a little bit of time setting this up, we can actually rattle through results really quite easily now, I think. So we're going to start off by choosing a regime which we think is going to be largely favourable to our soundproof models. Okay, so it's the regime in which things like the anelastic approximation is derived asymptotically. So we might expect it to do a very good job of explaining and actually describing the instability in this particular region. And so the point here is we're going to assume that HS is very much bigger than H rho, which in practical terms means our stratification is nearly adiabatic. That's the idea. So this minimises the stabilising influence of thermal stratification. You're very close to that stability threshold for convection set in, but just below. And it turns out, when you do the maths, that actually you can get magnetic buoyancy to work in this regime, even in the ideal limits. You don't need much by way of additional physics to get this to work. So let's keep things really simple, and let's set this horrible Newtonian cooling term to 0, just to make life easy. So the assertion is this should be a good regime for our generalized soundproof model. Okay, so we did exactly the standard thing. Right, we look for solutions which have a wave-like dependence in x and y and a growth rate sigma. And then to be a bit more specific about the scaling regimes that we've used, essentially we've assumed a weak field in the sense that v squared, the alphane speed squared, is very much less than the sound speed squared. So in terms of our initial equilibrium condition, that means the magnetic pressure drops out. So it's essentially non-magnetic in some sense. Length scales, we're free to vary these a little bit, but we're going to assume initially that they're sort of at least comparable, so that the scales perpendicular to the field are going to be no smaller than, no bigger than, let's say, the scales parallel to the field, which look like, roughly speaking, h rho to the -1. And the time scale is set really by the alphane speed and the density scale height. That's the idea. And as previously advertised, we're going to assume that the stratification is set up in such a way, hs is very large, so to get any kind of relationship between hb and hs, we need to induce this factor of v squared over c squared. So if hs is very large, of course, you can see that this term is then going to vanish. It's going to go. And g then is, roughly speaking, c squared over h rho. Okay, so a lot of details. I appreciate Friday afternoon might not be the best time to be doing this, but apologies for that. So before I'll kind of show you what this produces, I just want to kind of go back to the soundproof model and show you the consequences of these various approximations. In particular, the consequence of this, if g is, roughly speaking, c squared over h rho, it means all of these coefficients are either 1 or 0 at leading order. So that's the first thing to pick out. And it also means, if we're forgetting about this Newton cooling term, it turns out the temperature actually decouples from the rest of the equations as well. So we can actually forget about 2 of these constants. So g and f don't matter. And in this case, actually, 3 of our models reduce down to pretty much the same thing at leading order. It's only the Boussinesq equations that then look different. Okay, so let's see. So here's what we get. You kind of run the analysis through. You basically take your compressible equations, take the generalized soundproof equations, run the same analysis in the same scaling regime, see what you get. And there's various ways you can express these particular results. We've chosen to formulate it in terms of the pressure perturbation pi1 and the vertical components of the velocity uz. And I put these side by side so you can hopefully see the extent to which these are or are not comparable. And you don't have to stare at these equations for too long to convince yourself that actually they are entirely equivalent at leading order if we make these assumptions that all of these things are, roughly speaking, equal to unity. Okay? So you reproduce the fully compressible equations with this soundproof model if all of these things are, roughly speaking, equal to 1. And that's good news, because that's essentially what our soundproof models actually look like in this regime. So all of these soundproof models, except Boussinesq, that's the caveat I'm going to come back to in a second, they satisfy these constraints at leading order. If you're happy to make an additional assumption that you're looking at small scales, then Boussinesq is fine as well, because that means either that the pressure perturbation vanishes, in which case the dependence on J goes, or it means that the Z derivative terms on the left-hand side, maybe go back to these equations just to illustrate, it either means this term goes, in which case pi1 is 0 and there's no J dependence here, or if you're looking at small scales in Z, then the left-hand side of this equation is dominated by the d by dz terms, in which case these terms are then small. So under those approximations, everything else then matches up very nicely. And if you feel so inclined, you can then go through and derive a dispersion relation. And the fastest growing mode actually here in the absence of viscosity corresponds to ky getting very, very large. Okay? So under that approximation, you can derive a dispersion relation. You've got various possibilities then. You've got so-called interchange modes. So these are modes of magnetic buoyancy which basically correspond to no bending of the field lines. They're just sort of shifted bodily with respect to neighbouring lines. There's also the possibility of undulum modes, which obviously corresponds to kind of sort of bending of the field lines, as their name suggests. And I've written this in terms of, again, the scale heights, but probably more familiarly, if you rewrite this in terms of the background derivatives, in terms of the buoyancy frequency n, well, this is the kind of result you'll see in David's review on magnetic buoyancy in the Tackleline book from 2007. So we reproduce exactly the results we'd expect to see. So everything's fine so far. All okay. But of course, we'd expect it to be in this regime because we're nearly adiabatically stratified. What happens if we try and push the envelope a little bit? So stronger stratification. Okay. So particularly what I'm going to assume here is that HS is now comparable to the other scale heights in the problem. And the idea is we're pushing towards this sub-adiabatically stratified region just below the base of the solar convection zone. So there's a stronger stabilizing influence due to thermal stratification, and if you're going to do that, what you need to do is you need to include non-ideal effects, specifically alpha to be positive, to actually overcome this. So again, being mathematically inclined, we've done the kind of simplest thing we can think of that allows us to make analytical progress. In particular, what we've done is we've taken the limit as alpha tends to infinity. So we don't have to do this. I'll say a little bit about finite alpha in a couple of slides' time. But what this means is that your perturbations are then isothermal. Okay. So you can play the same game, same sorts of scalings. The only difference is now, of course, that G is now a little bit more complicated. It retains this contribution from HS minus 1. And we're assuming that all of these scale heights are also then comparable. Same procedure, and don't worry at all about the details of these, okay? Not expecting, there's not going to be a test later on the various terms on the right-hand side. But again, the point is that you can actually reproduce the fully compressible equations with certain constraints on these coefficients. That's the idea. So it all works surprisingly well in most cases. Okay, so some of the soundproof models don't work. Is that surprising? Maybe not. What is perhaps more surprising is that some of these, namely the GGG anelastic and the pseudo-incompressible approximation, do capture the correct leading order dynamics for this linear instability in this parameter regime. Okay? So we can get these soundproof models to work. We need to be a little bit careful about which ones we choose. And again, also true if we restrict attention to small scales, Boussinesq works as well. And you can play the same game. Time's marching on, so I'm not going to go through the dispersion relation, but you can do that. So almost before I finish, just to talk a little bit about generalizations. So we've used this kind of Newtonian cooling prescription really as an analytical convenience as much as anything else. Certainly an idealization. We've picked these two kind of very, very distinct limits. Alpha is 0, alpha tending to infinity. You can actually look at finite alpha as well if you're careful about how you scale it to bring it in leading order. And again, you find the conclusions are essentially unchanged in this case, in the sense that you get no additional constraints on the model in this case. You can have rotation, different orientations. Much the same analysis, much more complicated, but again, no further constraints then arise. The robust conclusion of all of this is that all of these cases considered, we have at least two soundproof models that can correctly capture the leading order dynamics in these regimes, which is good news. Okay, so to sort of summarize, we've certainly shown that a subset of the available soundproof models do capture the correct dynamics for magnetic buoyancy. Without making additional assumptions, the only models to do actually manage this across all of the regimes considered are the GGG anelastic and the pseudo-incompressible equations. And the kind of key takeaway is that the suggestion is that if we're going to try to construct some kind of more global model of this kind of instability, perhaps trying to kind of look at the kind of initial evolution, following it up through the convection zone, it might be that there's some mileage to be gained by exploring one of these two approximations in this particular context. Okay. A little bit of ongoing work. If I'd had another 5 minutes, I'd talk a little bit about energy conservation, which does place some additional constraints on this model as well. And we're just having a little bit of a look now. Again, this is very preliminary, whether we can do the same sorts of things with the reduced speed of sound technique to assess whether that gets the right answer or not in this particular case. This is open to criticism. All of this is for the linear problem. How many of these sort of conclusions really hold as we make this problem non-linear? Obviously, more work's needed to do this. And we need to have a more comprehensive treatment of the effects of diffusion as well. Very idealized Newton cooling prescription. So proper treatment of diffusion, thermal viscous nomic, is certainly needed as well. So with that, I will conclude. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions? Yes.
Thanks. That was a nice talk. For no particular reason, I'm curious about LBR in stable layers. And in particular, how did it do with the magnetic buoyancy instability? And how does it do with energy conservation? Because I know that was something to do with Vasil 2013. And also, LBR is the one that explicitly ignores the entropy term in the momentum equation. Just for background.
Yeah, so LBR does certainly conserve an energy, essentially. It's certainly true. But to get it to conserve the right energy to match with the compressible equation, you need to be pretty much in this near adiabatically stratified regime. So it's always conserving something, and that's something that it's conserving is getting better and better as you get more towards this region of asymptotic validity. That's the conclusion.
And how about with magnetic buoyancy?
Yeah, that's full magnetic buoyancy.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's exactly taking the ideal version of this problem, doing the kind of analysis that the Vaso et al. Did for this magnetic buoyancy case.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Another question? Yes? Chris, can you pass?
So presumably the crux of the matter is the difference between LBR and GGG, right? I mean, they are asymptotically identical when you're close to adiabatic.
They are, exactly.
And now they're not, but one does better than the other.
They're not in the sense if you're pushing this away from this asymptotic regime, then you start to see these differences.
So can you put your finger on why GGG works better where it shouldn't than LBR? Well,
yeah. So I think this is it. So I think it's not surprising that we see a distinction between LBR and GGG as we move away from this regime because of the approximation inherent in the buoyancy term. I think what is surprising is how well GGG does. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we're actually yet in a position where I can give you a definitive answer as to why that's the case. I mean, obviously, we've only got these two rather idealised limits, and it might be we just need to do a bit more analysis to get a handle on that. It is true to say that if you're doing the ideal case, GGG does not conserve energy in the same way that LBR does. So it's a slightly surprising picture in that sense. But you know, as I've noted, as we move away from this near adiabatic stratification, if you're going to get magnetic buoyancy to work, you need some kind of heating term in there, so you're away from that regime anyway. So yeah, it's a slightly tricky picture. Yeah, I agree.
Paul, I mean, your tests are all basically on linear theory, aren't
yes.
they? So, I mean, U is sort of small in these things, and I'm sort of wondering what actually is going to happen when you get to actual highly driven velocities. It's not clear to me that LBR and GGG, they might perform similarly, they might perform in different order from what you're actually suggesting.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. I think we'd certainly need to do some kind of non-linear analysis to really look at that. So I think one comment to make is obviously as fluxitudes rise out of this region, they are entering a region where we'd expect these soundproof models to perform better anyway. So it might be you get lucky that they become non-linear at the point at which the background stratification is actually closer to adiabatic. But that's highly speculative. And I think you're absolutely right that to really be absolutely definitive about this, we need to do some kind of non-linear test for sure. Yeah.
Maybe a related question, though different, is the fact that you've done everything ideal and visit. If you want to use that in practice,
that's right.
Numerical model.
Yeah, that's right. So if you put in viscosity, that will mean that the preferred mode is no longer ky tending to infinity. That will give you a finite preferred wave number in that sense. I would almost be inclined to shove this comprehensive treatment of the effects of diffusion, thermal, etc., into ongoing work because it is something we've just started to look at now, but it's far too early.
And is the limit of the viscous term in all those models trivial? Is it obvious that you will get the Boussinesq limit? When it comes to viscosity, it's not.
Yeah, I don't think the addition of the viscous term is problematic for the model. Okay. No, I think that's true. Yeah.
But you could do like a constant alpha in speed atmosphere. Constant alpha in speed atmosphere, you can do everything.
You can do isothermal, yeah, absolutely, yes.
Can you do it for your various things? Can you do it for GGG away from that might pin down which modes are? Yes,
it's an idea. It's a good idea. Yes. We haven't tried it, but yes, you certainly could do. I mean, Gilman managed to do this, obviously, did the perfectly isothermal case and everything else, and we could do something similar for sure. Yeah, so thank you. Yeah.
Okay, if there's no pressing question, let's thank Paul again. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank all the speakers of this afternoon and in general of the workshop, and the organizers of this third and final workshop of the program, Matt Browning, Peter Davidson, Chris Finlay, Lauren Jouve, Travis Metcalf, and Nathaniel Scheffer. Thank you very much for organizing a brilliant workshop. So for those of you that are going, have a safe trip back. For those that are staying next